Thank you very much. It is a great pleasure to be back here at Music at Menlo again. I always have a wonderful time here. I think the last time I was here was 2 summers ago, and we took this long walk across the vast Russian musical landscape together. And this past fall, I think it was in September, David and Wuhan invited me up to their beautiful new home in Ardsley, New York. And they let me drive their Tesla around the neighborhood. Thank you for that. And they cooked me the most beautiful meal, and they served me what must have been about 3 or 4 different kinds of wine and liqueur. And so when I was good and drunk, they asked me if I would like to give this opening encounter for talk about the musical lives of London and Paris and Saint Petersburg. And I heard myself as if from a very far distance saying, sure, I would love to do that. And I tell you this just so that you will know what you are in for. This is going to be a full evening's entertainment. There's a lot of ground to cover here again. We will be going from the early 16th century until the middle of the 20th century, alternating between these 3 great musical capitals. And I'm sure that many of you have been to my obsessive productions before, but for those of you who haven't, this will be divided into 2 halves, each equally proportioned, each a little bit more than an hour long. And to be more specific, we will start on April the 24th, 1509, and that'll be in London, and we will progress up until the middle of the 19th century in Paris, and we will take a break and go out and breathe the night air and think about what we have learned. And when we come back, if we come back, we will go to St. Petersburg in 1861, and we will progress until August the 9th, 1942. So that is the lay of the land that we will be covering tonight, and so I just want to wish you all good luck and bon chance and udachi vom. And in the way of prologue, I'd like to just spend a very brief time describing the musical life of St. Petersburg in the early 16th century. There was no musical life in St. Petersburg at the beginning of the 16th century because this boggy swamp at the intersection of the Okhta and the Neva rivers, where St. Petersburg would grow at the beginning of the 18th century, was still under the dominion of the Swedish Empire. It was called Swedish Ingria. So we will take St. Petersburg and put it on the shelf for about a half an hour, and we will concentrate on London and Paris until we get to the 18th century, starting, as I said, with April the 24th, 1509, which was the date that Henry VIII took the throne. And I picked that as an apt place to start because he was a great music lover. And over the course of his reign, which lasted until 1547, the musical component there at the court expanded quite a lot. It started out with 12 court musicians, ended up with about 60 of them to perform all kinds of religious and ceremonial occasions. And he was an instrumentalist. He played a number of different instruments quite well, and he was also a composer. And what you are looking at here is a compilation of his music during the first 9 years of his reign. It includes 20 of his songs, 13 of his instrumental compositions. And this one that you're looking at is called Pastime with Good Company, which is his song in which he extols the virtues and the pleasures of the kingly life.
Company with honesty is virtue voices to me. Company is good and ill, and every man had every will. The best ensue, the worst eschew, my mind shall be. If to use, wise to refuse, the shall I lose thee.
during his lifetime, King Henry VIII was a very highly respected composer. And you have to take that statement with a large grain of salt because it could be very dangerous not to respect Henry VIII as a composer. And in support of that statement, I offer you Exhibit A.
How'd you like our music? That air they played, it had a certain... Well, tell me what you thought of it.
Could it have been your Grace's own?
Discovered. Now I'll never know your true opinion, and that's irksome. For we artists, though we love praise, yet we love truth better.
Then I will tell your Grace my true opinion.
Well?
To me, it seemed delightful.
Thomas, I chose the right man for Chancellor.
I should, in fairness, add that my taste in music is reputedly deplorable.
And in fact, opinions about the quality of Henry VIII's music have been decidedly mixed since that time. And in support of that statement, I offer you Exhibit B. This is an assessment of his music making by a rather supercilious English musicologist. Henry VIII was an eclectic of the feeblest kind, producing an amateurish and equally dull mixture of incongruous methods and sometimes, as in the song Pastime for Good Company, harmonizing a plain tune in a fairly pleasing but decidedly elementary manner. So, if you actually enjoyed listening to that song, you can now go and hang your heads in shame. Just be happy that you still have heads to hang. Okay? So, as he was writing that song, Francis I was coming to the throne in Paris, and he, like Henry, was a very broadly educated man, and he had many passions for art and literature and architecture. And it was during his reign that you have he had a fascination with Italian Renaissance art and architecture, and he brought all of that to Paris at that time. So you've got the medieval Louvre turning itself into the Renaissance Louvre. And you have Leonardo da Vinci coming to live his last years in Paris along with the Mona Lisa. And apparently, according to legend, and this painting done a few hundred years later, he died in Francis I's arms. And also, as with Henry VIII, there was this great expansion of the musical world there, and he brought many of the finest musicians in France to be there at the court and to preside over ceremonial and religious events. And probably the most dramatic and large scale of these ceremonial events took place in 1520 in Calais. At that time, it was called the Field of the Cloth of Gold because of these gold tents that you see there in the back. And it was a part of his military campaign. He wanted to forge an alliance with Henry VIII. And so these two young kings met here on this field here, and they signed proclamations and they embraced, and then there were 2 weeks of festivities during which there was jousting and feasting, and also quite a lot of music was played. And the climax of this event was a shared mass in which they performed movements alternating between movements provided by the finest English composers and the finest French composers of the day. And there is a very nice reconstruction of this mass, a rather imaginative one done by an early music group called Dulce Memoire. And I'll play you a Kyrie that was composed around that time and that they included in this collection. It's by Claude de Sermisy, give you a sense of what 16th century French liturgical music sounded like. So this is Latin Catholic Mass music. But at this time, of course, all across Europe, you have the rise of the Protestant Reformation. And this had a very profound impact on music making everywhere, particularly in London. about 10 years after that event, in the 1530s up until the 1540s, King Henry VIII decided to dissolve the Catholic monasteries and the nunneries and the friaries. And these had libraries, and they were repositories of the manuscripts of polyphonic music that had been written during medieval and early Renaissance times. And much of that was just destroyed. It was just lost in that rather dramatic conflagration. And when he died, there was this succession of rulers who came and went at rapid intervals. And along with them, there was a swinging back and forth of musical styles. So, for instance, his son, Henry's son, Edward VI, was the son of Jane Seymour. And he was the first Protestant ruler there, Protestant-born ruler. And he and his caretakers, they really wanted to do away with the Latin Mass and bring in this more spare Anglican style in English. And this lasted until he died at the age of 15. And then the pendulum swung back across to his older sister-in-law, whose name was Mary. She was the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, and she was staunchly Catholic, and frighteningly so. They called her Bloody Mary because she had this bad habit of cutting the heads off of people who disagreed with her. And during that time, the music swung back to the Latin Mass style, but she only lived for 5 years, and then she was replaced by Elizabeth I. And she presided over this long period of political stability. She was there for 45 years. And like her father, she loved music and she loved to dance. And she also loved theater of all kinds. And so this 45-year Elizabethan reign was the time of William Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe and Ben Jonson and this raft of great Elizabethan composers. And the one there in the middle, William Byrd, is an interesting case because I tend to think that he personifies both sides of this musical pendulum swing because he had shifting religious allegiances during the course of his life, and so his musical style was also shifting. Early on, he wrote a lot of masses for the Anglican services, and they are pristine and clear, and of course they are in the vernacular of English.
We praise thee, O God. We know as we live alone. All the earth doth worship thee,
But his true sympathies were Catholic. He was a devout Catholic, and he expressed that more and more in his music the older he got. So by the 1590s, he was writing Latin masses. He wrote 3 of them. One in particular I'm going to play you a segment of. It's from his Mass in 5 voices. And I think it really expresses the depth of his true belief system. And it was not possible to play it at Westminster Abbey like that one you just heard because he was recusant. It was illegal to present these. And so they were presented at churches on the outskirts of London. And mere possession of the manuscript could have gotten him arrested. Here is a credo, which I think gives you a sense of the true power of his faith as expressed in this dense polyphonic music.
Confite
an extremely great composer, and he wrote this very powerful music. And fortunately, Elizabeth I left him alone for the most. I mean, she seems to have been tolerant, and she liked him and his music. And I think she particularly liked him because he wrote a lot of secular music as well, such as this collection, My Lady Neville's Book, and another one called the Fitzwilliam Virginal Book, which are collections of secular music and dances and pavans and galliards of the time. This one was composed for a lady there at the court of Queen Elizabeth who liked to play the virginal. And I'll play you an example of a piece that I like. It's called A Galliard's Jig. William Byrd was a very fine teacher, and his student, Thomas Morley, was really the most renowned composer of secular music at that time, and he's known for being the major proponent of this great flowering of madrigals that we think of as a central feature of Elizabethan music at that time. And madrigals actually were influenced by Italian-style music. There was a very fine Italian composer of madrigals and other polyphonic music named Alfonso Ferrabasco, who came from Bologna. He lived there in the court of Queen Elizabeth for a while in the middle of the century. He was influenced. And I'll play you a madrigal by him, which I like a lot because I sang it 50 years ago in my high school madrigal choir.
Sing we and chant it while ever that grant it, fa la 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 la. Not long youth lasted, and old age hasteth. Now is blessed leisure to take a pleasure. Fa la 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 la.
Sounds like good advice to me. Next time around, I'll try to take it. And this Reformation moved across Europe, and it had an effect on French music as well, although the prevailing sentiments there were Catholic. But they were translating hymn books from Latin into the vernacular of French, which infuriated the Catholic authorities, and they rounded them up when they could, and they threw them into the fire, along with the people who owned them more or often than not. But there was also this great love of court music and ceremonial dancing that went on, and much of it was gathered together into these volumes that they called danseries, which are collections of French pavans and galliards. This is a collection, as you see, from 1555 by a composer named Claude Debussy, and I'll play you another one that I like. It's called La Pavane de la Guerre. Crossing back across the Channel to London. In the late 16th, early 17th century, there was a very elaborate hybrid kind of multimedia form of entertainment called the court masque. And it was called that because people dressed up in masks, and they had these costumes and very elaborate scenery, which was designed by great architects like Inigo Jones. Much of it was very fanciful. The music was provided by people like William Byrd, and the scenarios by people like Ben Jonson. Very fanciful. And this was not opera, but it set the groundwork for the first true early 17th century operas by composers like Henry Purcell. And Purcell was such a powerful composer that he really became the British composer, or I should say perhaps the last British composer to be acknowledged as an icon of British music making until the dawn of the 20th century. And he had a short life. You see the dates of his life. He didn't make it out of his 30s, but it was action-packed, and he started early, and he became the court organist at Westminster Abbey when he was all of 20 years old. And he wrote a lot of liturgical music in that capacity, but he also liked plays, and he wrote a lot of incidental music. And he is credited with writing, if not the first, one of the very first English operas, which is called Dido and Aeneas. And if you know one song from Dido and Aeneas, it would be Dido's Lament, which takes place towards the end of the opera. And I'll talk about it for a few minutes because I think it is such a powerful piece of music that it gives you a sense of why his music was so beloved and became such an icon of British music making for such a long time. The backstory is the Trojan warrior Aeneas has been blown off course, and he has landed in Carthage, and there he has met Queen Dido, and they have fallen in love with each other, and they've had a fling. And then he is called back to Troy. He feels duty-bound to go back, and so he kisses her goodbye, and he leaves forever. And she builds a funeral pyre there on the shore and sets herself aflame. She does not take it well. And Purcell writes this aria, Dido's Lament, to express the full extent of her despair over this. And it is amazingly powerful, and yet it is built of very simple means. It's about 6 minutes long. And the whole piece rotates on top of this looping ground bass, which, as you'll see, consists of this descending chromatic line, this series of sighs that go over 5 bars and underline and mirror her despair for the entire duration of this aria. And when she starts to sing, her line does not adhere to this 5-bar format. Her first line just soars over for a full 9 bars, which has the effect of pulling us into the vortex of her despair. And Purcell very sensitively paints the words with dissonances. For instance, when I am laid in earth, this word laid is underscored by a dissonant sighing appoggiatura. And as this song develops, she reaches out to Aeneas as he sails off, and she says, "Remember me." And she says those words 3 times. And the first times that she says it, the first 2 times, she repeats those words in a stunned monotone on a repeated D natural. But the 3rd time, you'll hear, she arches up by this excruciating perfect 4th, which just unleashes the full dimension of her despair before her vocal line just descends sighingly back into oblivion. It's just incredibly powerful music, and you can tell, again, why the British public they said, okay, that's it for the next 200 years. And while English opera was developing there in London, French opera was developing in Paris, and also about 12 miles to the south in this ever-expanding court of Louis XIV at Versailles. And he reigned for this incredible 72 years. And during this time, like his predecessor, Francis I, presided over this great expansion of the arts in general, literature. This is the time of Molière and Racine. And Louis XIV himself was a great dancer, apparently. He loved to dance. And from about the age of 14 on, he liked nothing more than to appear in the court ballets. And this is a costume design of him at the age of 14, dressed up as Apollo, the sun god. And he was performing in a ballet that was written especially for him called the Ballet de la Nuit. Ballet was written for him when he was 14 by his favorite court composer, whose original name was Giovanni Baptiste Lully because he came from Italy. He was the son of Florentine millers, came from humble background, but very talented. He liked to dance from an early age. He liked to play the violin. He learned to compose. And as the story goes, he was doing all of this dressed as a harlequin as part of a Mardi Gras festival that was taking place in the town square of Florence, when he was spied by a visiting French nobleman who liked what he was doing and said to him, "Would you like to become the Italian tutor and the page of my niece? Her name is Mademoiselle Montpensier." And it turned out that the Mademoiselle was one of the high-ranking and wealthiest women in the court of Louis XIV. And so he said, sure. And moved to Paris, and that gave him an overture to Louis XIV, and he ended up writing that piece that we just were listening to. And that so impressed the young king that he just kept elevating him. He became the maître de la chapelle, and he became the head of chamber music and wrote a lot of ballets. And eventually he became the head of the opera there, the precursor to the Paris Opera, and they performed at Versailles and also at the Palais Royal there in Paris. And his operas are very elaborate, and they were called tragedies in music, and they tended to be 5 acts long. And they involved a lot of dancing because, again, the king liked nothing more than dancing in ballets that Lully wrote for him and ballet music that was incorporated into his opera, often in the role of deities such as Jupiter, the king of the gods.
Le roi danse! Donnez la plus belle musique du monde au dieu Jupiter, maître de l'univers!
These operas that Lully wrote for the king were based in mythological times. They often were presented to celebrate Louis XIV's military victories, and they begin with prologues with gods and goddesses and nymphs longing for his successful return from battle. And such a piece was his second opera, which was called Alceste, which was first performed in Paris, and then it was performed in the marble court outdoors at Versailles. And it begins, as they all do, with this strutting, pompous, dotted rhythm overture called the French Overture. he's credited with having invented this very authoritative, aristocratic, and rather pompous style of French overture, which became very appealing to the likes of Bach and Händel, who wrote in that style as well. And I think it gives you a sense of the autocratic nature of his own personality. During this period that he was the head of the court musical staff there at Versailles for Louis XIV, he arranged it so that nobody else could have their operas premiered or performed. He was just absolutely, in control. And he became probably the wealthiest and the most autocratic musician in history, and he owned many houses in Paris and in the countryside. And he was also known for being, although he had a wife and 6 children, just voracious sexual predator. I mean, he just was, just preyed indiscriminately on men and women of all ages and descriptions. And of course, Louis XIV had his own share of illegitimate children, and many of them were taken care of by this lady, Françoise d'Aubigné. And they fell in love with each other towards the end of the 18th century, 18th, 17th century. And he married her. And she was a devout Catholic, and she didn't like Lully and his debauchery. She really looked askance at him and what he was doing. And so she managed to turn the king's face away from Lully. And so after that, Lully finally passed away. But the whole structure of ballets and operas there became less colorful than it had been. And now that we have finally entered the 18th century, it's a good time to bring St. Petersburg off the shelf and to bring it into this encounter. The official date of the founding of St. Petersburg is May the 27th, 1703. And that is the date that, as you see in this painting by Alexander Benoit, Peter the Great stood there on the edge of the Gulf of Finland and had this vision of this great imperial city that he was going to found. And there is a poem by Pushkin called The Bronze Horseman, which begins with a prologue that describes this event. On a deserted, wave-swept shore he stood. In his mind great thoughts grew, and he gazed afar. And thus he mused, from here we shall strike terror in the Swede, and here a city founded by our labor shall gall our haughty neighbor. So nature gives command. Here, cut your window through on Europe, stand firm-footed by the sea unchanging. Here, by new sea paths, ships of all flags will come to us, and on all seas our great feast will open. And of course, it's a mythologized vision. But I think everything having to do with the founding of St. Petersburg and also Peter the Great himself is the stuff of mythology and legend. He himself stood 6 feet 8 inches tall. An enormous man, literally looked down on the populace and his subjects, mastered many trades over the course of his life. Some people say as many as 14. He was a master woodworker. He was a master shipbuilder. He dabbled in surgery and dentistry, if you can imagine such a thing. I read someplace that when he died, they discovered a sack of teeth that he had extracted from the mouths of his presumably terrified courtiers, which tells you more about him. He was a complete autocrat. I mean, he just believed in his vision no matter what. And as a young man, he ranged freely around Western Europe, and he was fascinated by the shipbuilding, but also by the layout of the cities. And so when he decided to build this city on this bog there, he decided to lay it out with European architects and builders, and to have canals like those in Amsterdam, and to have great waterfront palaces and broad prospects like the ones that he had seen in Paris and in Rome. And he had been to Versailles, and he wanted to have waterfront palaces that were in some way the equivalent of that. And, he felt that he had inherited this enormous backwards country, and it was his responsibility to exert radical perestroika on it and to sort of bring it into the 18th century in a hurry. And everything about this almost instantaneous appearance of the city there, built at incredible cost, and human lives, people dying of simple exhaustion, and there were infestations of mosquitoes, and it must have been awful. And so it gave rise to this mythos of St. Petersburg, which is, it would be the city of great extravagant beauty where life would be lived always on the edge of disaster. And he himself ordered all of his boyars to cut off their beards, and he ordered everybody to learn how to dance the minuet because he liked to have these assemblies, these Parisian-style balls that he required everybody to attend. And when he died in 1725, he was succeeded by a sequence of great empresses, and one of them was his own daughter, Empress Elizabeth, who was legendarily beautiful and vain and pathologically extravagant. She had 15,000, apparently, of these gowns, and she'd like to change her dresses sometimes 5 or 6 times a day, and she never wore the same one twice. And like her father, she liked to have masquerade parties and balls in the style of great Parisian balls, and she would invite 800 people at a time to come. And she liked Italian architecture very much, and so she imported great architects like Francesco Rastrelli to come and lay out these signature buildings like the Smolny Cathedral and the Winter Palace. And she also liked European-style music. And at this time, there was still no European-style music anywhere in Russia, and it was all Eastern Orthodox znameny chant and folk music. And so she imported Italian opera whole cloth. And so opera there in St. Petersburg from her time became Italian opera, both in style and in substance and in language. And when she died, she was succeeded by Catherine the Great, who reigned for another 34 years. And she was a great lover of Italian opera as well. And she brought many Italian opera composers up there to preside over their own operas and serve as her music directors for short times. A lot of them just simply couldn't take the climate, and they would flee back. And this one up on your upper left is Baldassare Galuppi, and he was also the head of the Imperial Court Chapel there at the Winter Palace. And he became the teacher and an inspiration for a homegrown Russian composer. His name was Dmitri Bortniansky, who was a very fine composer indeed. And he was very taken with Galuppi and Italian style, and he followed Galuppi back down to Italy, and he studied and became such a proficient polyphonic composer that they called him the Russian Palestrina. And eventually he went back up to St. Petersburg, and there she, Catherine the Great, appointed him to be the head of the Imperial Court Chapel. And so he was setting Eastern Orthodox hymns in Italian harmonization and Italian-style polyphony. And he wrote very powerful hymns. I'll play you one for Russian men's chorus called The Virgin Today. So you hear Russian folk elements are finding their way into, and liturgical elements, into the music of St. Petersburg at this time. Back in London, Purcell had really proved to be an artistic musical cul-de-sac. There was no ready English composer to succeed him. And so the next great composer to have a profound impact on music making in London was a German who came to write Italian opera, and his name was George Frederick Händel. And he came when he was 25 years old. He remained there for 45 years, became a naturalized British citizen. Before he came, he was ranging around Italy for about 3 years, visiting the major capitals, writing motets and Italian-style music, and he scored a huge success in Venice in 1709 with his opera Agrippina. And this really catapulted him to international fame, and suddenly he became a very hot property. And he was invited to come to London in 1710, and he was commissioned to write the first opera in Italian for the London court there, to be played at the Queen's Theatre. He wrote an opera called Rinaldo, and it was a hit on the scale of Agrippina in Venice. People just loved it, I think largely owing to such absolutely exquisite arias as Lascia ch'io pianga. They didn't speak Italian in London, but they didn't have to be seduced by music like that. And so Italian opera became the style of opera there in London for the 18th century, just as it was in St. Petersburg. And he really hit his stride in the 1720s, and he was writing operas and having them produced at a rate of sometimes 3 times per year, now played at the King's Theatre. And he wrote 39 operas there, and during this time he became the head of several commercial opera companies. And other opera composers came because they saw the market there, and they began to have their own Italian-style operas produced there in London. And this went on, and finally, when he got into his 50s, I think he grew tired of the rivalries and the debacles and finances and theaters going up and burning down. And so he retreated into writing these great oratorios like The Messiah and Judas Maccabeus, and these oratorios on which his status as an icon of British music making still rests today. And even 100 years after he died, they were having these great Händel festivals in the Crystal Palace with choruses of 2,000 people and orchestras of 500. We cross back across the channel to Paris, and the successor to Lully was Jean-Philippe Rameau, who was a superb composer, and he wrote tragic lyrical tragedies like Lully had, based on antique mythological characters and ballets, and it was wonderful. And the French public, being ripe for a rivalry, divided themselves into the Lullists and the Ramistes. But this was also, the beginning of the Age of Enlightenment, and you have great philosopher writers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who loved Italian opera, and he began to clamor for something more up-to-date, something having to do with actual people and not gods and goddesses, and people with blood flowing in their veins. And such an opera came to town in 1752. It was by another Italian composer named Giovanni Battista Pergolesi, and it was called La Serva Patrona.
Sempre in contrasti, con te si sta, e qua e là, e su e giù, e sì e no, or questo basti, finir si può, che ti parerà?
It was really just what the doctor had ordered there. They loved it. And you can see why. I mean, and it really looks like a kind of a advanced copy of The Marriage of Figaro by Mozart, because you've got this, exotic Spanish setting and this irritable aging master and this cunning, saucy maid. But remember, this is 1752, and Mozart wasn't even born until 1756. This is a long time before The Marriage of Figaro was composed. Mozart, 7 years after he was born, came and he played for Louis XV at Versailles, and as an adorable child prodigy, everybody loved him. But 14 years later, he came back at the age of 22, and now he was at a very different part of his life, and he was trying to escape from the Archbishop of Salzburg and his father's domineering influence, and he was trundling in a coach across Europe with his 58-year-old mother in tow, looking for a job, unsuccessfully. And they wound up living in Paris during the summer of 1778. And they took a small, dank, dark apartment, and she sat knitting quietly in the dark while he was out hustling for work, and she contracted typhus, and she died on July the 3rd, which was a terrible way for this to end. But during this period in Paris, I think he wrote some of the first truly great music that he wrote. And while he was looking to write pieces that people would like, he wrote a symphony, which we now know as the Paris Symphony, to be performed on a very prestigious concert series there called the Concert Spirituel, which took place in the central pavilion on the second floor of the Tuileries Palace. And they have their conventions, they had things the way they liked their music to be written, and so he was trying to adhere to those conventions because he wanted, again, to impress the Parisians, but he was also getting very tired of all of this and had a rather jaundiced opinion of them by that time, and he wrote to his father to tell them how this new symphony was going, and he said, "I hope that these idiots will find something in it to like. I've taken care not to overlook the premier coup d'archet, which was a very fancy term to describe a very simple technique where all of the instruments, including the timpani, had to begin with a firm blast of sonority." Remember that guy. So he continued in his letter to his father, "What a fuss these boors make of this. What the devil, I can't see any difference. They all begin together just like they do everywhere else." It's a joke. A few years before Mozart came back to Paris, another German-speaking composer came and had a great success with Orpheus and Eurydice translated into French. And this was an enormous success for Gluck, and his operas were loved in the end of the 18th century there because they were written in French and they had Italian characteristics, but they also had this new German overlay in their expressive qualities, and they were very influential on composers in the early 19th century, like Hector Berlioz, who loved the music of Gluck. And in 1789, the Bastille was stormed and the revolution was on. And as soon as that was over in 1795, they formed the Paris Conservatory. And these are all people who served as directors and people on the teaching staff there, very esteemed people at the time. And the one in the lower right, Jean-François Le Suerer, was a successful composer of comic opera in the 1790s, and he was elevated to become a member of the faculty there, and apparently he had a prickly personality and managed to get himself fired. But he was saved and elevated to the position of maître de la chapelle by Napoleon Bonaparte himself, who apparently liked him, and asked him if he would be the musical director and preside over the coronation music for his own self-coronation as emperor on December the 2nd, 1802. And he wrote a piece, rather Beethovenian piece for chorus and orchestra called Tu es Petrus. Beethoven himself, back in Vienna, was not too happy about this event, and it caused him to scratch Napoleon's name off of the title page of the Eroica Symphony with such force that he took a lot of the paper with it, as you see. And this accession of Napoleon Bonaparte to the throne of France had an impact, of course, on the artistic life of France, but also on the artistic life of Russia, because the signature cultural event and inspiration of the early 19th century in Russia was this disastrous decision Napoleon made to invade Russia, and then this rout and his defeat and retreat. And that inspired great authors like Pushkin and great composers like his friend Glinka to want to write literature and music that would be truly Russian in its impetus and in its style. And Glinka, his big moment, his big success took place in 1836 with his opera. It was originally called Ivan Susanin, and then it became known as A Life for the Tsar. And he picked as its subject 17th century hero, patriotic hero of Russia, Ivan Susanin. And everybody loved it, I think largely because although it catapulted him to fame as the composer of the first truly Russian opera, in fact, it was an Italian opera. I mean, it was written in Italian style with arias and with recitative and with choruses, and the music even sounds Italian. And there's this overlay of Russian folk style to it, which makes it very appealing. I'll play you a bit of the final chorus, and you'll see what I mean. So everybody loved it, and they started saying, write us another one. And it took him 6 years, and he collaborated with his friend Pushkin, who along the way died in a duel. And that kind of cast a pall over this concept that he had of Ruslan and Ludmilla. But it was premiered in 1842, and it didn't do very well. Everybody came. They were all expecting another Life for the Tsar. And the Tsar, Nicholas I, was there, full of expectation, and apparently about halfway through he began to yawn, and finally he just got up and left. And this really cast a pall over the event, and at the end there was hissing, and somebody in the critical staff said everyone went home subdued as if after a nightmare. So it didn't go over well. And Glinka was a sort of a hothouse flower. He had grown up on the landed gentry, and he couldn't take this. And so his life began to spiral downwards into an alcoholic malaise, and eventually he decided just to leave entirely with his tail between his legs, and he wrote an angry letter to his sister in which he described Saint Petersburg as vile and hateful. He said, "The local climate is definitely harmful to me, or perhaps my health is even more affected by the local gossips, each of whom has at least one drop of poison on the tip of his tongue." So he did not take it well. And he wrote another piece before he left for Berlin. Actually, he orchestrated an earlier piano piece. It's called the Valse Fantaisie. And you remember earlier I was talking about this ethos, this mythos of St. Petersburg as this place of great imperial grandeur and beauty where life is lived on the edge of disaster. And this piece, it has this quality of imperial triumphalism. And on the other hand, it's got this sense of longing and a kind of a sinister danse macabre to it. He was a big favorite of the great choreographer George Balanchine, who set it to dance 3 times. And you can hear the influence on Tchaikovsky later in that century. he liked Glinka's music, and it has, I think, a lot of his orchestral and operatic waltzes have this flavor to it. They draw inspiration from it. So going back to London, music was still becoming more and more continental. They were getting away from English composers, and they were embracing composers like Haydn. And Haydn had an enormous success there. They wanted to bring him from about the 1780s on, but he was still working in northwest Hungary for the Esterházy family, couldn't get away. Finally, Prince Nicholas, his mentor, died, and so they got him to come, and he crossed the Channel on the 1st of January 1791, which was the first time. He was 58. He'd never seen the ocean before. And he arrived there in London, and they loved it. They just flocked to hear him. And it was the beginning of a very exciting time in his life and in the life of the British musical public. One of the people who heard his inaugural performance was a musical historian of the day named Charles Burney, who said, Haydn himself presided at the pianoforte, and the sight of that renowned composer so electrified the audience as to excite the attention and a pleasure superior to any that had ever been caused by instrumental music in England. And he came back, he spent a year, and then he came back in 94 to 95. And during these times, he wrote a lot of string quartets in Vienna and there that were premiered there, a lot of chamber music, 12 symphonies, capped off by his valedictory symphony 104, which we know as the London Symphony, which he himself conducted on May the 4th, 1795, in this valedictory performance, which was a benefit concert in his behalf. Everybody loved it, and he went back to his lodgings, and he wrote into his diary, "The room was full of a select company. I led a new symphony in D, the 12th, the last of the English. The whole company was thoroughly pleased, and so was I. I made 4,000 gulden on this evening. Such a thing is only possible in England." And word got around in the continental musical community that London was a great place to go and to play and to fill your purse. And in 1829, Mendelssohn went. And they loved him too. He was 20 when he first arrived, and he conducted his first symphony. And especially for the event, he removed the third movement, the existing scherzo movement, and he replaced it with the third movement of his octet for strings, which he had written when he was 16, 4 years before, only he orchestrated it. He gave it a full version with winds and the whole treatment. And I think perhaps it's significant because he's writing it for the English public, he's orchestrating it, and his sister Fanny had said about this movement that it was meant to depict the music played at the golden wedding of Tatiana and Oberon in the Midsummer Night's Dream, and it's supposed to represent the sound of this orchestra of fairies and bugs and insects playing for the wedding. And they loved it, and they were all smitten with it. And he was smitten with them, and it was just a real love fest. They got along very well, and he came back many times over the course of his life and is credited with raising the standard of orchestral playing there and musical life in general because he was a superb conductor as well as pianist and composer. And in 1842, he had a private audience with Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, and they loved him too. And he played for them. And she went back to her chamber and she wrote about this in her diary. She said, "Mendelssohn asked us to give him a theme upon which he could improvise. We gave him Rule Britannia. and the Austrian national anthem. The way in which he blended them together and changed over from one to the other was quite wonderful. At one moment, he played the Austrian anthem with the right hand and Rule Britannia with the left. We were all filled with the greatest admiration. Poor Mendelssohn was quite exhausted when he was done playing. So if London in the mid-18th century was the time when many great continental composers liked to go and play and fill their purses, Paris in the mid-18th century was the place where many great continental composers liked to go and actually live. For instance, Chopin, 1831, left his native Warsaw, ended up there in Paris, lived the remaining 18 years of his life there. The peripatetic Paganini played a legendary recital for 3,000 people. It was a benefit concert for cholera victims at the Opera House, Salle de Pelletier. And it was attended by Liszt, who had lived there since he was an adolescent and had learned to speak French so well that it became his favorite and preferred language for the rest of his life. And he was so impressed by Paganini's concert that it inspired him to want to become a piano virtuoso on the order of his violin virtuosity. And he was a very eloquent writer, and he wrote a description of the musical life there in Paris in the 18th century, in 19th century. He said, "Paris is the pantheon of living musicians, the temple where one becomes a god for a century or for an hour, the burning fire which lights and then consumes all fame." And Rossini knew a thing or two about having his fire lit and then consumed in Paris. He came in 1824 with The Barber of Seville and other great Rossini operas, and they loved it, and they elevated him to become the head of the Théâtre Italien at Salle Favre there. And then he began to write French operas, and finally he had this great grand finale of Guillaume Tell, which was performed in 1829 in Paris at the Paris Opera, and they didn't like it. And it was so discouraging to him that he left Paris with his tail between his legs, and for the remaining 39 years of his life, he never wrote another opera. Grand opera became grander and grander, culminating in the middle years of the century. I think in 1849 was the premiere of this 5-act behemoth by Meyerbeer called Le Prophète. And there were, by this time, 5 acts, and you needed to have a big ballet in the middle of your Parisian opera. And so Verdi came, and he wrote ballets into operas that we know as not having ballets. When I played in the Met Orchestra, we recorded an album of Verdi ballet music that he had composed for this opera. And we had never heard this music. We never played it. Ballet music for Otello and Don Carlo and I Lombardi and even Aida. And in 1851, another front in the operatic wars there and opened with the Théâtre Lyrique, where they wanted to have operas done in French, and so a lot of French composers like Bizet and Massenet and Gounod, but also foreign composers like Wagner had their operas done. He had Rienzi done at the Théâtre Lyrique in French. And then Jacques Offenbach, who came from Cologne, but had spent a lot of time in Paris, opened up his own small opera house there, the Théâtre des Bouffes Parisiens. And he had a big success in 1858 with Orpheus in the Underworld, which is this very satirical opera which took pot shots at the emperor, who came and liked it a lot, apparently. And finally, in 1856, Rossini came back. He seems to have missed being a part of this pantheon of the living composers, and he had grown older and corpulent, and he bought himself a beautiful apartment, and he would have these magnificent dinner parties where he himself would cook. He was a wonderful chef. And he began to give these salon events where all of these different composers would come and play for each other, and just, it was apparently a lot of fun. And at the end of his life, he wrote a whole series of short piano pieces and songs that he called The Sins of My Old Age. And as my final offering here before we take our break, I'll play you one of them that I like. It's called Petite Caprice in the style of Jacques Offenbach. Thank you.